Hello, everyone, and welcome to the January 2022 edition of She the People TV's Women Writers Fest. Thank you for joining us. Today's panel discussion is about reliving painful memories, the courage to write. How do authors muster the guts to write about anything and everything? How do they transcend fear and possible social censure to share intensely personal and often very painful experiences? Today we have with us the authors of two compelling memoirs, Manjiri Indurkar and Farah Bashir. Manjiri Indurkar is the author of It's All in Your Head M, published by Tranquebar Westland. Her chapbook of poetry, Dental Hygiene is Very Important, was published in 2017. Her forthcoming debut poetry collection, Origami Eye, will be published in 2022 by Westland. Her works have appeared in prominent literary journals. Farah Bashir was born and raised in Kashmir. She was a former photojournalist with Reuters and currently works as a communications consultant. Rumors of Spring is her first book. Welcome to the fest, Farah and Manjiri. It's a pleasure and privilege to be chatting with you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Manjiri, let me begin with you. It was a sudden bout of diarrhea that caused you to take a long, hard look at your life, the very physical manifestation of child sexual abuse that you suffered. You realized that the deep-seated trauma was struggling to surface. Is it at this point that you felt compelled to begin writing? Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yes, I mean, when the diarrhea happened, when it was a rotavirus attack, so when that happened, I kind of got thrown into this pit of despair almost. Depression started setting in a really hard way. And so I had all of this time and I couldn't understand what was happening to me. And I started seeking help. I was in therapy at that point. And so all of this unlearning that was happening in therapy, that like all these patterns that I had formed, all the trauma informed patterns that I had formed all of my life, my therapist was helping me unpack them. So I did start writing at that point. I mean, not the book. The idea of the book came much later, but at that point I was writing a lot of essays, which have been published by Scroll and Skin Stories. So I wrote about my child sexual abuse incident, not an incident, my history with child sexual abuse and trichotillomania and like a bunch of other things. I did start writing at that point. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Farah, what prompted you to write the memoir? You were in fact living in extremely turbulent times. Blood, gore, deaths, curfew were an everyday occurrence. In fact, as a young girl growing up in Kashmir, you were forced to hardly be seen or heard. It was quite a cloistered existence, right? Even when there was so much going on outside the house. So, did you feel like asserting your voice and those of other people around you? What is it that made you write?
When insurgency erupted, like I clearly remember that 1 hour I had gone to get a haircut at a salon, and by the time I came, we stepped out of the salon. The whole city, everything around us had changed. So that suddenly that made a lot of that created a lot of changes in me as a young girl. I was a normal, ordinary young 12-year-old. So on the same day, my second cousin was killed. He had also gone out to get a pair of shoes for Eid, which was the next day. So that survivor guilt, which now one knows what had what had happened and now one processes that, and one knows it was survivor guilt. But at that point, it was just the silence. It was this very heavy silence that had set on me. And during Manjiri's experience, that was the time when I started pulling out my hair. And I sort of had trichotillomania for 28 years till I started writing. And once in a while, if there is an extremely stressful situation, I lapse. So it was, how war is not a homogeneous experience. People go out and there are demonstrations, protests, killings, and there is a war that happens on the streets. And then there's war which is experienced by women and young children inside, and was literally to talk about. I mean, I wasn't sure the book was going to ever get published, especially given the political climate that we currently are in. It was a way of processing our existence, in a sense.
I get that. Now let's talk about the titles of your books. In fact, Manjari, it's all in your head, M. What made you choose this title? In fact, what was going on in your head? You have mentioned voices of Toni Morrison, and which you later felt is the voice of I. So why this title?
Because most of the time the voices that sort of lead the march do not belong to those of your supporters. It's always the naysayers, who are trying to kind of put you down, who are kind of telling you that, just do some yoga, or like eat well, or think positive, like those kind of annoying things. And so what they're trying to tell you is that, like, none of this is real. It's happening in your head. And so I thought that this is a good idea of beginning my book with this title, because sure, it's in my head, but doesn't mean that it's not happening, or doesn't mean that I'm not suffering because of that. I mean, it is also part of the body. So yeah.
Yes. And Farah, your book, in fact, the word rumors strikes a deep chord. Because as if, yes, there is news about spring, and spring is about to arrive, but maybe these are rumors. So, do you not nurture the hope of the arrival of spring in Kashmir?
Well, I mean, if we were to look at the title from that aspect, we've always seen betrayals. I mean, that's what we're used to. We're not really used to a promise being sort of upheld. But that's the analysis of the title. But what happened? I was, a lot of us, a lot of my generation, we seek refuge in Aga Shahid Ali's poetry, and he was the first one to articulate what was happening, and he sort of gave words to our feelings and experiences. And it was actually one of his poems that I was reading, and this title just spoke to me. This phrase just spoke to me. And the memoir that is out there today, it underwent changes. As in, I was writing fiction first, and I've been
Yes.
working on this for the last 10 years. And then, but the title stayed. So it was almost like, because you have to go and you have to really examine all the trauma and all the events that lead up to trauma, you can completely just fall off it, and decide not to do it and not to rake up the past and go
Yes.
back into
Yes.
it. But I think it was a phrase of strength that continued to stay with me, and it propelled and compelled me to write the stories that I wanted to write.
Thank you. Your books are divided into sections. Farah, in fact, your book has sections denoting the time of the day, like dawn, morning, afternoon, and there's one titled Afterlife. Now, how did these sections come about? It's not a linear narrative after all. Like, you can't say, okay, this happened in the morning, so let me write about this. This happened in the afternoon. No. So, how did that come about?
Structurally, it was the funeral that I'm talking about, and then I'm explaining parts of the funeral, and I'm just breaking the day into various parts. But when I was writing, and all these years that I've been living, it feels like you wake up on the same day every day. It's like life for a Kashmiri goes in a loop. It's never different. It's something. The first thing I do in the morning is check Twitter just to see if Kashmir is trending. Have there been killings? Has there been an encounter? Has there been something? Because it's like you wake up on the same morning every day, and I don't know, is there an afterlife after this? So it's almost like exploring that. But yeah.
Manjari, your book is also divided into four parts that are further divided into chapters. So, what made you structure the book so? So, did you have an overarching narrative structure in mind when you began writing the book?
I did. I had like sort of a skeleton of the book, and I knew where what would go, or where I would like certain things to be. So I begin with the rotavirus attack, because I mean that is where I think I started acknowledging that there is a problem. Uh, but it's like you said, it's not a linear narrative. The idea was to kind of also show that recovery is not linear either. I mean, like I've been in therapy for like 10 years, a little more than 10 years now. I've been in and out of, like, I've been on and off medication. Uh, and there have been good phases, but there have been terrible phases too. So like I wanted the book to also reflect, like, in the middle of all of this chaos going on in my head, there were good parts also. And so I did not want to do like a linear narrative kind of a thing. And yeah, I had created a structure, and I more or less stuck to it. But also that's like an anxiety thing for me. I need to have like a structured approach towards things that I am doing, or I can't function well. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Farah, your book begins in 1994, the day your grandmother passed away. And her funeral is the thread that runs throughout the book, tying the chapters together, like you said. Now, can you tell us more about your grandmother and why you felt it necessary to have her as a constant presence in the book? She
Sure.
was, I believe, your anchor.
Yes, she was. She was literally the center of my world. And so, three things to it, basically. The first memory I have of the conflict is seeing her without her headgear, almost mourning because she thought that I had been killed. My cousin who was killed.
Yes.
So there were no cell phones, no phones at that point, and there was this. People had said, "Inke ghar mein somebody has been killed. A kid has been killed from this particular family." So they weren't sure who it was because three of us were out. So when we reached home and I saw her in that state, that was my introduction to a world that had changed beyond recognition. So she sort of is the image that I associate with how the world's changed, how the conflict began, the armed conflict. And then she was also someone who had a very towering presence. She would give career advices. She was a very progressive woman. Her daughter, she like my aunt, who was pursuing her PhD. Her father didn't know about it. It was only because her mother was so pro education and she hid it from her husband, my grandfather, till my aunt actually went ahead and did her PhD because she really wanted me to become a doctor. Our next door neighbor, Kashmiri Pandit, was studying to be a doctor, and she was very fond of her, Lakshmi Shri. And she would tell me, like, she would keep looking her. She would wake up in the middle of the night to pray. She would see her and she would tell me, become a doctor, but become a skin specialist. I think in her understanding somewhere, skin specialists didn't have to sacrifice their sleep. So she couldn't bear with the thought that I would have to, stay up at night. So she was someone everyone looked up to, went to advice, and suddenly you see how conflict, how violence, how everything what was happening out in the world changed her stature in the house. She was like, her presence became like progressively started becoming smaller and started shrinking because she knew nothing of this world. She used to sit by the window and she used to see the world go by, and she used to, like, spend her days like that. She used to communicate with her daughter, who was a lecturer at a college nearby, through the windows, and she would see me off going to the school there. And suddenly the windows were shut for years. She was forced to stay indoors. She would ask me what a bunker was, what did it look like. She had no idea what it was. She was lost like a child. I had a glimpse of how humanity can be dwarfed through her, literally. And I didn't realize I used to have panic attacks about other memories, about other things that happened in the 90s. But I didn't realize that this was actually the biggest trauma that I had of her, of how war changed the lives of elders, of people you were close to, till I began writing. So when I read all these chapters, like you said, the narration is not linear because I think the memory isn't linear. You
Yes.
you chance upon things in different ways. But she was literally the anchor even after her passing, which sort of held it all together. I had barely written two chapters after her death.
Manjari, the dedication in your book mentions, apart from your Ai Baba, of course, for Aji who does know, right? And uh, it must have been your grandmother knew about the sexual abuse that you were subjected to. She chanced upon it, but chose not to acknowledge it for reasons unknown. And you were a child then. So obviously you were not aware of what was happening and whether it was right or wrong. And because obviously she did not object or stand up for you, you must not have known at all. But so it must have been in hindsight that, right? You must have uh, sort of confronted this very painful letdown. So how did you cope with reliving this memory while writing? Because it's a lot about acknowledging it. It's a lot about answering, why, trying to understand and also perhaps trying to forgive.
Yeah. So so by the time I started having these conversations with myself, my grandmother had already gone a little senile. I mean, she wasn't diagnosed, but she was put on medications for schizophrenia. So, I mean, like I couldn't have confronted her anyway. And by the time I started writing about my trauma, she had already passed away. So there was no way I could have asked her. Right? There was no way I could have had any conversation with her. So I think from the age of 24, when I actually started like going to therapy and talking about these things, I started putting like a lot of things from her life together because I needed her to make sense to me. Because I mean, she was wonderful with my brother and with me also. Like a lot of times, she was amazing. There was always some distance, and I did not understand the distance then. Now I do. In hindsight, I know that like she was kind of witness to what I was going through, and she did not help me much, and probably that the guilt of that, it kind of also pushed her away from me. But beyond that, I mean, she was not a bad grandmother. So I do not know why she did what she did. So what I did was I started asking questions to my parents and to our relatives about the life that she had, and I started putting it all together so that it made sense to me. Uh,
Mhm.
and to forgive her, I don't know. I mean, it is something that I have to do, to live with myself, to live with this thing that she did. I mean, I need to find an excuse. I need to figure out her reasons, or whatever she was going through, to accept the fact that like, I was not unloved
Mm.
by her. And yeah, I mean, yeah, she was just a victim of the system of patriarchy, of whatever, of the way we live. uh, and that is what compelled her to not take an action. Yeah, I don't think that this is an active decision. It is something that like it just kept happening, and at some point I just decided to let go of the anger, because I mean, what good does it even lead to? She's dead now. I can't do anything about it. So yeah.
Mhm. See, exactly what I mean. Writing a memoir is like exposing yourself, warts and all, right? It's a slice of your life. It's like putting yourself under a microscope for public scrutiny, and you're making yourself utterly vulnerable. So, were there any fears when you began to write? If so, what were they? And how do you transcend these fears? And I'm not talking only about the writing process, I'm talking about the reactions. I'm talking about, I will come to specific questions about the people in your life. But otherwise, when you began writing, Manjari, you can tell me first, and then Farah can take the question. What were your fears?
I think a lot of unkindness in the world in general. So, uh, so again, like I've been writing about mental health for like a decade now, and most of the time people have been good. Most of the time people have reached out and they've been kind. But then there are also these people who will say very unkind things, and
Hmm.
they're like, get over yourself, or there are other problems in the world and people are dying and getting killed and all of that. Like,
Hmm.
why does your problem occupy so much space? So, I mean, while I acknowledge that there are bigger problems in the world, of course, but I mean, I have to live with my problems, and I don't want to constantly keep hearing that, get over yourself. So, one of those things was
The
definitely,
trivialization. Yes.
yeah,
The
yeah, yeah,
trivialization. Yes. Yes. Go
yeah,
on. Go on.
yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think you were going to ask about the people in my life who entered the book,
Yes.
so I will kind
So
of address
Farah,
that.
yes. Farah, what were your fears? Because now you could have been put up against a system, an entire system, right? These are not very kind times. So, what were
Yeah,
your
so
fears?
that was it was personal and political in a way. Personal was
Yeah.
to it was not fear. The personal were not fears, but it was the sheer courage to go back and
Hmm.
relive a time day in and day out for years. And with fine. I mean, I had a therapist, but most of the times, you have to deal with all these things by yourself. Well, I remember when I wrote about 8 chapters, first 8 memories that came to me, I had a nervous breakdown. I had to take a break from writing for about 6 months. I was put again
Hmm.
on medication, and then I was like, no, I have probably hit the rock bottom. Let's see what happens. Let's continue with it and let's write it. I used to get panic attacks and sleep. So that was a personal struggle with going back and reliving those times. Second
Hmm.
was, in media especially, and the way Kashmiris have been portrayed in the last few years has been, it's
Hmm.
about demonizing them, dehumanizing them. So there's the space for empathy is shrinking for Kashmiris or for the marginalized overall. And therefore, how do you create your narrative, and how do you tell your story that will sort of connect and some people will relate to it and create a space for empathy? I think.
Hmm.
And then of course there was the thing that you are up against a system that
Hmm.
could sort of, so, but that was really the third part for me, because we grow up seeing that. We see that, I mean, right now, if you look at Kashmir, what's happening, whether it's journalists, human rights activists, defenders, they're all locked up. So we this thought doesn't even cross our mind, that, if we say some, I mean, it crosses our mind all the time, sorry, that we could be a tweet away
Hmm.
from being picked up. So that's something that's like a uniform reality for everyone. But the other two were like, how does one tell this story where there is so much of baggage that the
Hmm.
readers will have?
Hmm. Hmm. So, who were the people that held your hand? Did you have beta readers, people who took you through it, who you could talk to? And which books encouraged you to write on when you had doubts, or if you ever did? And because, see, Manjari, you were touching upon a subject that is considered taboo, okay, which is best left alone and not spoken about at all. And Farah, of course, for you, the personal was also the political, and that could have very different ramifications. So, who were the people and who were the books that kept you going? You can take that question, Manjini, first, and then Farah can.
So there were a lot of friends of mine, writer friends, who were my beta readers. Um, this friend of mine, she's a poet and a professor at Jindal University, Nandini Dhar. She really helped me sort of, uh, cull out the excesses from the book. Ria Rodriguez Mukherjee, she's also an author. She read my entire book. She was actually my first reader. So yeah, there were friends like that who did that for me. My brother, he read parts of the book and he helped me a lot. But I was rereading Jeanette Winterson's "Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal" when I was writing the book, because, like Farah mentioned, there were there was so much trauma that was surfacing while writing the book. So like I was getting nightmares, and there were like these periods where I was just like not able to write at all, like long periods. Like I think I went like almost 3 months without any writing, uh,
Hmm.
because I just like couldn't function because of whatever I was unearthing at that point. And so Roxane Gay's Hunger helped, because
Hmm.
she was also talking about the same subject almost, and she deals with the body in like a larger sense, I would say, than I do. But so yeah, Roxane Gay helped a lot. Joan Didion helped a lot. Uh,
Hmm. Okay.
and like just for fun, sometimes I used to read some childhood books like Alice in Wonderland was something that I just like would go back to. So yeah, I mean, like these were the things that I was doing. Like a lot of women writers, I would say, helped me when I was writing my book. Uh, Nandini's poems that I was reading, Sumana Roy, she helped. in some sense. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people, like of my within my ecosystem of writing in Indian English writing ecosystem, and in general, like international writers, women writers, a lot of women writers. Yeah.
Farah?
Yeah, it's actually the same what Manjari is saying. A lot of women writers, whether it was Toni Morrison's rereading, Toni Morrison's texts. There is one particular author from Palestine, Swad Amiri. She's an architect turned author, and she has this book about when she was caught in curfew for 40 days at a stretch. It's called Sharon and My Mother-in-Law. And I went through it, and I saw experiences were so similar, and what they were going through, and it's basically a compendium of those memories that she has from those 40 days. I didn't actually show my book to many people till I wrote it, because a lot of friends knew that I was writing, and a lot of people in Kashmir are writing all the time. So it's a way of processing your memories, a way of staying alive, a way of sort of uh, resisting erasure in a way. So it's like everyone is writing a book there. So I didn't want to show it to anyone before it was ready. I would show chapters of it to my youngest sister, and she would just like read them. It was almost like just purging it out of your system. But yeah, Mirza Wahid is one friend that I would say who read the second last draft, and and that was one person who I sort of knew that he would not just dismiss it, or another person writing a book. But yeah, I was very I just wanted to get it done. I wasn't sure if I would have the
So
courage.
did you have any expectations or goals when you began writing? In fact, did you expect a catharsis, or did you think that the process would be therapeutic? Did it at all facilitate coming to terms with what had transpired? And honestly, I want you to ask this honestly. Do you think writing has the potential to heal, or um, can you actually say that you've reached a point where, well, I don't hurt anymore and I can look at these things dispassionately? Can you do that, Farah?
I don't know really, because let's say it's a bit similar to how we look at PTSD in people from conflict zones. The trauma is perennial. The assault is ongoing. Let's say if there had been a resolution, if there had been truth and reconciliation and justice that had followed, probably there was a closure of some sort. But you see, I mean, that these memories happened then. August 5, 2019 happened when one couldn't communicate with one's parents for like a month, and we didn't know what had happened to them. So these are big events, but on a daily basis people in ones and twos are being killed, and now there is this new trend that has happened in Kashmir where people are killed and their dead bodies are taken and buried somewhere else. So I remember there was this incident earlier this year where there was this businessman who was killed in an encounter, and there were videos on social media of his daughter, a 13-year-old, and she's like, "Hame unke kapde de do." I mean, where are his clothes if you have buried him somewhere? So I was just sobbing looking at those videos. So I don't know really if it. I mean, some experiences probably people heal from. I mean, writing definitely you're getting a lot out of your system, but it also depends on what is going into your system day in and day out.
Mm-hmm. Manjari, what has your experience been with this?
I don't really know if I believe in the word healing anymore, because I mean, I hope that there is some form of recovery from the trauma that happened at some point. Uh, and the book obviously helped. Again, I do not know if it was therapeutic to write it, because it wasn't. It was very traumatic. It was very difficult to write it. Uh, but it sort of made me see a lot of things. It sort of like made me realize a lot of my patterns, a lot of the things that I was doing. So there was some sort of awakening, more than healing or uh, or anything else. About the healing, like the pain diminishes in some ways. Like I do not get as anxious thinking about what happened in my childhood that I used to get, 10 years back or 5 years back even. But then there are phases that you're going through something, uh, something very current that has happened in your life, and like the minute it happens, the associations that you form with that event kind of also throw you in your childhood, or that is something that happens to me. So like it is something that is always happening. uh, Sometimes it fades away, sometimes it feels like it happened yesterday. So what the book did is it helped me cope with it better, it helped me live with it better. And now that my story is out in the world, that more people know about it, more people close to me know about it, I don't need to hide it, so like I am unburdened by the book, more than healed by it or anything. Yeah.
But your books have come out at a time when, well, there is a wider scope for readership and reach, but there is also such a lot of room for trolling, for opinions, judgments. Anybody just comes up and says anything from random quarters. So, what I want to know is, did this ever make you want to abandon the project? Because the aftermath is not always predictable. It could be very different from what you thought. I mean, you must have calculated the personal cost, but um, what has, the aftermath could be very, very different. So, Manjari, how has it been for you now? Now that the book is out, are readers reaching out? What have the reactions been?
A lot of people are reaching out, and the reactions are mostly positive. And funnily enough, every time a reader has reached out to me, Farah's book has also been mentioned. It's almost
Okay.
always been
Oh,
like, hey, I read your book and
huh.
then I read Farah's book, or I read Farah's book and then I read your book. And like, oh my God, it feels like, I can connect with it. And even though Farah is writing about a very specific experience in Kashmir and none of us share that, but I think at a very personal level, uh, people have, women, especially younger women, have reached out to me and said that this feels like you're writing about me. And even men, I would say that like a lot of reaction has been that like a lot of older men reached out to me saying that I actually had a conversation with my daughter if they experienced something like this when they were growing up. And so I feel like there has been a lot of empathy and kindness, and in terms of the reactions that the book has gotten. Uh, Trolling and trolling, or those kind of things, I mean, I wasn't very worried about. I mean, unkindness thrown at you in your DMs or whatever, that is something that I was a little wary of, but I don't think I was thinking about trolling as such. Yeah.
Farah, what about you? Because uh, there is a lot of, you never know how things can be perceived. People are being locked in for sedition and stuff like that. So you were treading dangerous territory. So what have the reactions of readers been?
There was definitely this fear that, I mean,
Mm,
in fact, what happens at the publisher, HarperCollins has this legal team. So they go through the
mm,
memoirs. They basically fact check everything.
mm,
So when I remember submitting manuscript for the first time, it came back to me saying there were 14 places where they said you could be tried for sedition, just for
oh,
mentioning a word like routinely, or just for mentioning a word like a very a word that we probably use loosely. And so, therefore, if you look at the notes section, I had to put a lot of citations for a lot of
mm,
events that had happened in the 90s. So, whether it's Gav Kadal massacre or whether it's Havel massacre, I remember Havel massacre is something that it was assassination of Maulvi Maulvi Umar Farooq, and then after when his funeral procession was taken out, a lot of people were killed, and my brother-in-law survived that, and I'm telling his story. And I remember in the last reading, the legal reading, the legal team was like, if this didn't happen, drop it. I was like, I just added a page and a half of citations for that particular thing. So for me, it was really giving you almost the evidence and the documentation of these memories are not false and that it had happened. But so I had done my work, but like you said, you can't control the public reaction once it goes out in the public domain. There is always that thing. I was wary, but I have been, like Manjari said, totally taken taken aback by the reaction it has garnered, by younger women, by people around me. And it's been about a year now since the announcement of the book came out. Until date, on every single day, there are posts or there's a mention somewhere about the book. So I'm like, maybe people are all connected more than we think. We're all connected intimately that by our experiences than we actually think.
In fact, Manjari mentioned somewhere that she believes that once the book is out, it belongs to the reader, and that the author has to learn to let go. So, Manjari, do you think you've been able to do that, or are you struggling with it?
I think, yeah. I mean, I've always believed that my writing, once it's out, it doesn't really belong to me. So when somebody is having a reaction, like a good reaction, bad reaction, whatever, I don't really interfere with that. That's entirely your reading, and the book belongs to you now. I mean, it belongs to me as well. Obviously, I wrote it, but the interpretation, the meaning that you derive from the book, whatever it is, it belongs entirely to you. Uh, so yeah, I mean, I'm not too bothered about this. It's floating in the void now. Let it reach wherever it wants to reach.
Yeah. So Manjari, though this is your memoir, this is your story. There is a mention of other people also in it, right? So you must have always constantly felt, what if someone gets hurt, someone feels miffed, okay? So did you talk to those people, and did you have to take written permissions, and did you have to change names? And there must be those who probably wanted to be mentioned in the book. It can work both ways, and some who didn't want to. So how did that go?
Nobody I know wanted to be named in the book. I mean, everybody is
Okay.
like too private, so that was never a thing, and I was not lucky enough to get permission for that. So I informed all of my friends, all the people in the book, most of the people in the book, not the abusers. Most of the people in the book were informed that they will be mentioned, and I asked them if they wanted to be named or if I should change their names, and so they told me to change the names, and I did that. So there are no real names in the book. Everybody's names have been changed. Everybody's description, if any, has been changed. So the only thing I did was to one, change names and make people unrecognizable. So like I did not mention any recognizable markers or qualities or whatever. So when I write about my ex, obviously his name has been changed, and I do not mention the region he belongs to, where he comes from, what he's doing. Like none of those, very specific markers were there, so it doesn't land me in trouble. But yeah, mostly people knew that I'm going to write about them. So yeah.
Farah, what happens when there is something that you want to mention and somebody objects to it, but it is extremely important that you write about it, and you know that someone's going to get hurt in that bargain? Then what did you do? Did you ever face something like that?
I didn't because, to be honest, I didn't feel any such specific thing. But what I did was because I was writing from a time where, I was a child who had undergone tremendous trauma. So I didn't want these to be just made up memories in my head. So when I wrote the first draft and these memories which were coming to me, I spoke to those people, most of them. uh, in fact, there was an aunt of mine who survived a massacre. I remember she came home once and she had she was on a bus that was like everyone was sort of killed on that bus, and she was probably one of the couple of survivors, and her shoes were filled with blood. And I really wanted to write about that, but I couldn't really get the details because she had passed away. But everyone
Hmm.
else in the book who I could, I didn't tell them I was writing. I would, in Kashmir, it's very common to relive those days from the 90s, and you just start a conversation, and just to see whether whatever you've written is true or not. And sometimes more details would emerge actually, and then I
Hmm.
would just add them in. Yeah.
It's because memory can be so treacherous, right? I mean, they can be very sharp memories, razor sharp, or they grow fuzzy over time. So they can be also obscured by your emotions, your perspective. So considering that authenticity and confronting the truth are hallmarks of a memoir, did you struggle at any point with uncertainty about something? Did you have any notes or diary entries to fall back on? Can you give me a quick answer to this? We've just about 2 minutes left. So, Manjari, can you tell me that? Did you have anything to fall back on? Did you have notes?
not notes, but like my diary entries were there from my childhood. So I mean, I could read them, but like they were mostly very idiotic. I was not talking about anything important, just like random events were mentioned there. But to deal with the whole conflict with memory, that like it is not reliable. I actually mentioned it in the book at one point that like memory is a little fuzzy thing. So this a particular event that I'm addressing in that it is mentioned as like I remember it at this way and I remember it this way as well. So either of these things could be true because they feel very true to me, both of them. So like my therapist said, it is possible that you had these conversations at two times, so that is why you remember it like that. uh, yeah, I mean, I think I just acknowledge that like these are things that have happened, that the lack of clarity is obviously because of the time and distance that I've had from these events. But I mean, none of this is untrue. It may not be to the point, it may
Yes.
not be absolutely factual in terms of like, yeah, this happened then, but it is true. None of it is untrue. Yeah.
Thank you. For our last question, what are you working on now?
I'm working on a group portrait of women spanning across a decade. It's about sisterhood and how when men were sort of either going away or being killed, and it's how women in wars sort of it's about sisterhood in wars and the solidarity and the courage and the support system that you have. So it's a loose adaptation of Little Women uh,
Okay.
instead of
Okay.
Kashmiria.
And Manjari, what about you?
I'm only pretending to work on a novel, but like the speed is like so slow, so slow. I am literally not doing anything. Anyway, my day job takes up a lot of my time. So I mean, there is something in my head. I have made notes about it. I've written some 5, 6,000, 10,000 words or that's it. But I do not know when I will be done with it. I have a poetry collection that is coming out, so I'm trying to stay positive and just like look at that day. Okay, another book coming out. Let's see.
Thank you, Manjari and Farah. Thank you for sharing, for writing this book, for sharing such intimate things. Feel totally honored. Thank you for your time. And thank you, viewers, for being with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Archana. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be here on this show.